Rain. Blasted rain. As if the darkness wasn't enough, then nature was to force the cold and wet upon him. Trekking along the muddy road, the man felt the sword on his back, then looked down at his black outfit. Had it not been for his thick cloak, his clothing wouldn't have dried in the least since his earlier mishap. The wind picked up, the downpour whipping against his face. Pulling his hood further down, he strode on. The town was close, light shining in the distance. Reaching the outskirts of the settlement, the swordsman surveyed the nearby buildings. The rain was becoming heavier, so he needed to get inside. A distant din of conversation caught his attention, and a few houses down the street he saw a structure resembling a tavern with a metal sign hanging from the exterior wall. It read, "The Salty Merchant Inn." Kicking the muck off his boots at the door, he stepped inside. Down his calves, rows of buckles chimed as he crossed the room. A blaze flickered in the large open fireplace along the far wall, tables and chairs standing in rows throughout the room. Many were occupied, the space buzzing with drunken stupor. Pulling his hood back, the tall swordsman stopped in front of an empty counter. Slamming his fist on the wooden worktop, he forcefully cleared his throat. "I'll be right out," a man's voice called from a room at the back. Within moments, an older man came through. He was short, his belly protruding underneath a stained linen shirt. He had an apron around his waist, scratching his bald head as he stepped forward. "Welcome to the Salty Merchant Inn, good sir." "Give me something edible," the swordsman said in a gruff, low-pitched voice, his words somewhat stiffened by a northern accent. "And a pint of good mead." "That'll be 3 copper, sir." Dropping the coins on the counter, the swordsman walked away in silence. He sat down at an empty table, the sheathed longsword on his back knocking against the backrest. Adjusting the baldric across his chest, he shifted its position for comfort. He went on to unclasping his cloak, throwing it back across the chair, then rubbed at his neck. Holding his hand up in front of him, he noticed fresh blood coating his fingers. Luckily, the wound wasn't deep, but it would be another scar to add to the collection. "Here you go, sir," the innkeeper said, setting down a plate of cooked eggs, pork, and a couple of boiled potatoes. "You seemed like you needed a good meal, so the extra is on the house. Just spread the good word." "I will, thank you." The swordsman cleaned his hands on his cloak, then grabbed the fork and ate in quiescence. The mead was poor, but good enough for the occasion. Leaning back in his seat, he silently listened to the background noise around him. The hammering of rain on the roof seemed to have finally dampened. "A game of hazard, stranger?" someone asked, prompting the swordsman to turn. A middle-aged man had addressed him, sitting together with several of his friends. They were throwing 2 dice, betting on various numbers to be rolled. "Why not?" the swordsman replied, spinning his chair around. His robust build made those around him flinch. They had likely not expected him to be so large. One pressed his arm into a neighbour. "Let the stranger have a go. You've lost enough, Bill." Being handed the dice, the swordsman moved them around in his hand. 7. A hum of bets was spoken around him. Then the swordsman flicked the dice over the table. They counted 7. "He rolled the main," the first man announced. 2 of the others cursed, having wagered against him. 9, the swordsman stated. The bets got louder this time. Discussions held. The dice were thrown, landing with 9 visible markings on the top. "Blast!" someone swore. The swordsman smirked, scratching his bearded chin. 9 again. A pint of mead spilt over the floor, and men cramped around the table. The dice landed on 9. "He nicks!" "I know!" a man snarled, flinging his coins over the table. "Sod him and his luck!" He stood, slamming his hand on the wooden piece of furniture. Rising to meet him, the swordsman clutched the hilt of his blade but left it in its scabbard. "You better not make a move, if you wish to keep your head." "Oi!" the innkeeper shouted. "No fighting in here! Take it outside if you have a disagreement!" The two men glared at each other, the first finally settling down, but their eye contact lingered. "I passed a turn," the swordsman declared. Hefting his pouch, the swordsman seemed satisfied with his winnings. He grabbed his belongings and headed for the door. It was pitch dark outside, close to midnight by now. The rain had let up, but it was still drizzling. Swinging his cloak over his shoulders, he walked further up the road. It would take him a few hours to reach the camp, but at least he was no longer cold and hungry. Hearing a strange noise behind him, the swordsman spun, being faced by a man mounted on a dark horse. An arrow flew in his direction, and he ducked out of the way, the projectile hissing past. It was the tavern-goer he'd had a disagreement with earlier, who had lost a substantial number of coins while gambling, most of which the swordsman now carried in his satchel. The less-than-sober attacker awkwardly nocked another arrow, drew, and quickly let loose. In a single swipe of his hand, the swordsman had his blade unsheathed, dodging the shaft as he batted it aside, then charged. Slashing across his opponent's leg, he severed the limb, blood instantly spraying. Reaching up, he grabbed hold of the attacker's shirt, pulling him to the ground. The horse whipped its head at the sudden upheaval, rearing back from the men. "No! Please spare me!" the attacker cried, whimpering miserably as he attempted to crawl away in the mud. "You didn't listen!" the swordsman hissed, replacing his grip on the weapon. Swinging down, he severed his opponent's neck, the head rolling clear of the body. As silence fell, he stood up straight and looked about the nearby houses. No one had noticed the fight. Bending, the swordsman clutched some of the attacker's shirt, cut a piece of fabric off, and used it to wipe his blade. Sheathing the cleaned sword, he then walked up to the frightened horse and grabbed the reins. He hushed, running a hand over its muzzle, soothing the mount. It was a black gelding, steam billowing from its nostrils. The broad hooves soon ceased to move, and the animal's head came down against him. Satisfied it was calm, the swordsman walked around and placed a foot into one of the stirrups. Vaulting into the saddle, he touched heels to the beast, and it set off into a sprint.